Good morning. There's a little Rain Man in each of us. Let me tell you how I've come to that conclusion. A 10-year-old boy is hit by a baseball. When he recovers, he is a calendar calculator and now remembers the weather and every event of his life every day since that time. A 40-year-old corporate trainer dives into a swimming pool and has a concussion. When he awakes, he's irresistibly drawn to a piano, which he's never played before. He goes to the piano and begins playing like a virtuoso. A gentleman running a futon store in northwest state of Washington gets mugged and has a traumatic brain injury. When he wakes up, he sees these images in front of him, very colorful and very complex. He barely graduated from high school and hated math, but a physics professor tells him those are fractals. And he says, "What's a fractal?" Because he is not understanding math whatsoever. An orthopedic surgeon in New York State is struck by lightning. He has a near-death experience and wakes up and is irresistibly drawn to classical music, which he's never had an interest in classical music before. He listens for hours and hours and hours to the classical music and finally learns to play the piano and now performs concerts as often as he performs surgery. These are cases of the acquired savant. That's a situation in which ordinary people like you and me have some kind of a brain injury or brain incident, at which time some new ability, musical, artistic, or math, emerges spontaneously and explosively. There are three kinds of savant syndrome. There's the congenital form, where children have these islands of genius that you've seen many times on television. There is the acquired savant, and then there is the sudden savant. And these are ordinary people like you and I who don't even have a brain incident or a CNS incident, but have a moment, an epiphany moment, where they suddenly are able to be musicians, artists, or mathematicians. I met my first savant in 1962. I started a children's unit at Winnebago Mental Health Institute. There were 800 patients in the hospital, and we took 30 of those under 18 and put them onto a unit. I remember the first little guy that I interviewed there, and I said, "Jimmy, how come you had to come here?" And he said, "Because I had a nervous breakdown." I said, "Jimmy, what is a nervous breakdown?" Well, he said, "A nervous breakdown is when nobody loves you." Well, we had other children on the unit, most of whom were autistic, and three of them caught my attention. One little guy had memorized the bus system of the city of Milwaukee. And if you told him the bus number at the time of day, he'd tell you what corner that bus is going by. A second little guy, you could take a 200-piece jigsaw puzzle, put it on the table picture side down, and he'd put it together with the rhythm of a sewing machine just from the geometric shapes. The third little guy was an expert on what happened in this day in history. Every morning I'd come on the unit and he'd say, "Dr. Treffert, do you know what happened on this day in history?" I'd try to bone up the night before. And this was in the day of the encyclopedia, not Google, but I could never outdo him with his mastery. We had a fourth little guy who made free throws. He held the ball in exactly the same way, his feet in exactly the same place, and since it's a fixed trajectory, he always made the free throws. So I became interested in the savant syndrome, situations in which people with disabilities have some remarkable ability that stands in stark contrast to overall handicap. I then went on to become director of the hospital, so I didn't have a whole lot of time to spend on savant syndrome. Running a mental hospital, by the way, is a very interesting occupation. One night I had to go back to the hospital because there was an emergency situation there. I was in my street clothes, and I must have been looking very anxious because one of the patients came up to me and he said, "Say," he said, "I haven't seen you here before. Who are you?" Well, I said, "I'm Dr. Treffert. I run the hospital." He gave me a very knowing, a reassuring look, and he said, "Well," he said, "you'll get over that. I thought I was the governor when I came in here." So I kept superintending and paying some attention to savant syndrome. And then in June of 1980, Leslie Lemke came to Fond du Lac to give a concert at Goodrich Little Theater. I wasn't at the concert, but my daughter was. She came rushing home and said, Dad, I just saw a miracle. I said, what'd you see? I saw this lad, he's blind, he's cognitively disabled, he has spasticity that he can't even hold a knife and a fork, but it disappears when he sits down at the piano, and he's playing Tchaikovsky and other serious music, having heard it just one time. And I said, well, honey, that is a miracle, but it's also called the savant syndrome. There happened to be some people from the wire service in that concert, and they carried the story of Leslie Lemke and his marvelous mother, May, who was the lead in The Woman Who Willed a Miracle, where Cloris Leachman played the part of May Lemke. The story was picked up by Walter Cronkite, and he used that as his Christmas story. And Leslie became a bit of a celebrity. We made the talk show rounds. We were on Oprah 3 times, and 60 Minutes 3 times, among all the other shows. The 60 Minutes program, some of you may remember, in 1983, it featured Leslie, Alonzo, the sculptor, and George, the calendar calculator. Watching that program was Dustin Hoffman. Dustin Hoffman was moved to tears by Leslie Lemke, and he said, I want to play the savant. And he went on to play the savant in the movie Rain Man. And of course, Rain Man is the best thing that's ever happened to autism in terms of public awareness and public understanding. I had the privilege of being a consultant to the movie Rain Man. They wanted the movie to be sensitive, and they wanted it to be accurate. And indeed, it filled both those criteria as far as I'm concerned. I met my first acquired savant in 1986. Alonzo Clemens is a sculptor. He was injured as a child in a bathtub accident. And after that, he began to sculpt anything he could get his hands on. Butter, Crisco, anything at home he would sculpt. He's become now an international sculptor, and he can complete one of those little horses that you see there. He'll complete one of those in 45 minutes. I then came across my colleague, Bruce Miller, who's a neurologist in San Francisco, and he reported 12 cases of patients with dementia, who, as the dementia proceeded, became musicians or artists or poets. And they all had a lesion in the left anterior temporal lobe with a particular kind of dementia. And then there's Tommy McHugh in London. Tommy is a laborer who had a stroke, became a prolific painter and poet. And if ever there was an unlikely person to become a painter or a poet, it was Tommy McHugh. I have about 75 such cases now from around the world of acquired savants. Well, how did he do it? What happens is there is injury to the brain, often in the left hemisphere, but not always. There is recruitment of undamaged tissue in the right hemisphere, most of the time. There is rewiring to that, and then there's the release of dormant potential. And it's that dormant potential that is the little Rain Man within each of us, whether it's music, art, or other abilities. It's what I call the 3 R's, the rewiring, recruitment, and release, which explains what happens to the in this situation, which is a marvelous happening. In some of the cases that I've seen, I think you'd simply be amazed at. The challenge, of course, is, okay, if that dormant potential is there, how can we tap it without having a head injury or a stroke? And that's where my work is taking me at the present time. And there are some ways that we can access that. There are 5 different ways, as a matter of fact, that we can access that. First of all, there's electronic stimulation. We know, for example, that we can put a part of the cortex to sleep electronically using RTMS, as it's called, to see whether, if we do that in a volunteer, does some savant ability emerge? And in fact, it does, as demonstrated by Dr. Alan Snyder in Australia. He's invented what he calls the thinking cap, which you put on and does this kind of stimulation, and in a temporary way, at least, people do become smarter with respect to solving problems and accounting and some other kinds of things. We're all accustomed now to heart pacemakers. Those are every day. We will soon have brain pacemakers. We have some already. Some treatment of Parkinson's disease, the treatment of intractable depression, uses electronic stimulation, and I think ultimately some of the control over epileptic seizures will be with implanted electrodes. Secondly is pharmacologic ways to approach and make ourselves smarter. We know, for example, that if we take amphetamines, the short-term memory improves. But there are problems with amphetamines in terms of side effects and addiction. And so we have to develop better pharmacologic advances. LSD, as you know, is like an explosion in the brain. If we could use a rifle shot of LSD instead of the shotgun approach, I think we would be able to tap some of those ways. And brain boosters will become authentic. They're already on television. You see one found in the jellyfish that people keep talking about. I don't know why the jellyfish. But we will have some authentic brain boosters as time goes on. Meditation and hypnosis are ways of achieving different levels of consciousness, and we're just really beginning to unravel the mysteries of consciousness. There are some cognitive approaches that can be used. There's a book called New Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain. And this artist takes executives and others and teaches them how to draw, not because she wants to make them artists, but because that gets them in touch more with the right hemisphere of creativity and seeing the big picture. And in our executives and our politicians, we want people who are able to see the big picture. And finally, there's something I call rummaging in the right hemisphere. That's less dramatic, but it's something we can all do. Many of us want to wait till we're retired to study anthropology or our passion for philosophy or making an orchard work like the one that I'm learning. Don't wait until you're retired. Go on your bucket list sooner with those kinds of things that otherwise may seem frivolous, or when I get time, I'll be able to do that. And I use as an example my trips to Chicago. Usually when I go to Chicago, I'll take the freeway, get there in a hurry. Can't remember if I went through a scene or not, because I'm sort of unconsciously driving along. But some other days I'll say, I've got a little more time today. I'm going to take Highway 41. I'm going to go along the lake shore through those beautiful neighborhoods and those little parks and villages. I'll get to Chicago, but the trip has been a hell of a lot more fun than just on the freeway. And that's what I think I'm trying to get people to do, to rummage, as I say, in the right hemisphere. So savant syndrome teaches us several things. First of all, it teaches us that there is this dormant potential within us all, and the challenge is how to tap that without having a head injury or other incident. It teaches us, even more importantly, about brain plasticity. We've had a rather negative and pessimistic view about the brain's ability to heal itself. But the rewiring and the release teaches us that there is a great deal to be learned about brain plasticity, which is a very positive message. Let me illustrate that, because there's plenty of room for us to access more of our central nervous system. There was a man in London went to his doctor, and the doctor, because he had a twitch in his right leg, and the twitch didn't go away, so they said, let's get a CT scan and let's see what that looks like. So they got a CT scan, and this is what a normal brain ought to look like. You can see the skull is full with cortex and lower areas of the brain. This is what this gentleman's CT scan showed. He has using less than 10% of his whole cortex. He is married, he has a job, and he has a normal IQ. Some say we use less than 10% of our brain capacity. I think that's probably an overestimate. And this shows us the potential of that magnificent organ, the brain. If anything I've learned in my 55-year trip is the magnificence of the brain, its complexity and its intricacy. Then there's this little boy in London who was born with hydrocephalus and spina bifida. The parents were told, don't expect much from him if he even lives. And mom was out shopping for a coffin, as a matter of fact. And he was born, and that was his CT scan. Now that should be like the one above with all that cortex. He has less than 2% of brain tissue, and yet he's alive. And to everyone's surprise, as mother worked with him so intensively, he began to speak, he began to learn, he began to go to school. And when we did the CAT scan 3 years later, this is what we saw. 80% of the brain reinvented itself. The headline first read, "The Boy Without a Brain." Now the headline says, "The Boy Who Grew a Brain." So there's so much to be learned, so much territory to be explored. And we're just on the cusp of that. I gave a lecture recently to fourth grade students, and that's the challenge, let me tell you. This is easy, that was difficult. They asked some interesting questions. They said, how come there's more boys than girls savants? And how come not everybody with a brain injury ends up a musician? Those kinds of penetrating questions. And at the end of the lecture, a little boy and a little girl came up to me and the little boy said, I want to be a neuroscientist. And the little girl said, me too. And the payoff of those 55 years of work that I've been doing with these sensational people called the savants, the payoff for that, for me, will be when that young boy and that young girl walk across the stage, get their diplomas in neuroscience, and carry on where I've left off. It's those fresh new explorers that are going to take us farther and farther into the intricacy of this marvelous organ, the brain. And when they do that, they will take us farther than we've ever been in both understanding the brain and human potential. Thank you.